is my legal news assignment on Chapter 5, Constitutional Law. My case for today is Baker v. Carr, 1962. Facts of this case. So, if we go to the background, Tennessee had not redrawn its legislative districts since 1901. Population changes had created malapportionment in the state's representation. The plaintiffs, Charles Baker and other residents of Memphis, Tennessee, v. Joe Carr, Secretary of State of Tennessee. The population disparities. The districts with as few as 10,000 people, others with more than 100,000 people, the value of a vote varied from person to a person. The legal basis. The failure to reapportion Tennessee's legislative districts constitutes a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. The initial rulings, the lower courts held it was a political question that the courts could not review. Now, the public concern increased the attention to the unfairness of a representative value, and its concern raised demand for a judicial review of electoral processes. The legal issue that was presented by this case here was including questions about the role of federal courts in state legislative apportionment, the applicability of the Equal Protection Clause to state legislative redistricting, and the concept of a political question in relation to judicial review. The case asked whether the failure to redraw Tennessee's legislative districts violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. It also questioned whether the issue of legislative apportionment was a political question that should be resolved by the state legislature rather than the courts, and how this affected judicial review and the federal power. Additionally, this case raised many concerns about the effects of malapportionment on the principle of one person, one vote, and its implications for fair representation. The outcome of this case set a precedent for future litigation on electoral representation and voting rights. The arguments of the plaintiffs. The equal protection violation. In their complaint, the plaintiffs alleged that Tennessee's legislative districts were malapportioned. The 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution, the Equal Protection Clause, stipulates that no state may deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. By instituting legislative districts that were disproportionately populated, Tennessee had, in the plaintiff's view, violated that cause. Now, the justiciability of the claim. The plaintiffs also stated that the case was justiciable, and the Tennessee legislative apportionment was thus something over which the court had jurisdiction. The Tennessee legislature had not succeeded in providing all citizens with equal representation, and the court was capable of remedying the situation. The population disparities among electoral districts. In support of the argument, the plaintiffs adduced evidence that Tennessee districts varied wildly in population size. For instance, in the state Senate, one district had a population of 10,300, while another had a population of 110,100. The plaintiffs maintained that this resulted in a de facto situation, in which a vote in the less populated district was worth significantly more than a vote in a more populated district, which was to say that the state's electoral law failed to adhere to the principle of one person and one vote. The dilution of voting power due to malapportionment. Now, the plaintiff's argument that failure to reapportion the electoral districts in which Tennessee citizens resided resulted in a de facto diminishment of the voting power of some citizens, specifically those who lived in urban neighborhoods, via those who resided in rural districts, that is, the power of some citizens to politically influence the state's affair was, in fact, being diluted, and that this was equivalent of partial disenfranchisement as a result. The policies promulgated by the state legislature were not reflective of the people's will. Federal intervention present. The plaintiffs noted that the U.S. Supreme Court had in the past acted to provide redress for malapportionment. In state elections, citing the case of Baker v. Carr, the plaintiffs in Baker v. Carr had also challenged the malapportionment of the Tennessee state legislature, and the court had ruled in that case in a manner consistent with the remedies they sought. In other words, the plaintiffs in the case under consideration contended that the federal courts had the right to intervene in the matter, and the failure of those courts to do so was deemed unconstitutional. Call for fair representation. To this end, the plaintiffs sought a court ruling that would mandate the fair representation of the people of Tennessee in the legislature and ensure that all voices were heard and given equal weight in the lawmaking process. The arguments of the defendants. Political question doctrine. The defendants argued that the issue of legislative apportionment was a political question and thus not justifiable by the courts. They claimed that the Constitution does not explicitly grant the judiciary the authority to determine the apportionment of legislative districts, and that such matters should be left to the discretion of state legislature, state sovereignty. The defendants asserted that the states have the power to regulate their own electoral processes without interference from the federal courts. They argued that the Constitution grants states the authority to manage their internal affairs, including the administration of elections, and the federal courts should respect this aspect of state sovereignty. Historical present. The defendants pointed to the historical present of legislative apportionment in Tennessee, arguing that the existing system had been in place for decades and had not been challenged. They claimed that this long-standing practice provided stability and had been accepted by the people of Tennessee, and that sudden changes could disrupt the established political landscape. Absence of harm. The defendants also argued that the plaintiffs had failed to show any direct harm caused by that apportionment. They claimed that the electoral process was functioning properly and that the existing districts did not significantly affect citizens' ability to participate in elections or have their voices heard. Legislative intent. The defendants maintained that the state legislature had acted within its rights and intentions when creating the redistricting plan. They argued that any changes to districting should be made through the legislative process and not by judicial mandate, as elected officials are better positioned to understand the needs of their constituents. Political disruption. The defendants warned that court intervention could lead to the confusion and disruption in the electoral process. They expressed concern that judicial rulings could undermine the stability of the state governance and potentially leading to conflicts between states and federal authorities and creating this uncertainty in future elections. The judicial restraint. The defendants also called for judicial restraint, arguing that courts should not overstep their authority and encroach upon the legislative domain. They emphasized that the principle of separation of powers, asserting that the judiciary should not interfere with the legislative functions of the state government unless it was necessary. The court's decision/outcome. The Supreme Court, in a 6-2 decision, as you see below for who they voted for Baker and for Carr, held that federal courts have the power to hear cases concerning the apportionment of a legislative body. In the decision, the court found the issue justiciable under the Equal Protection Clause and held that the failure of the state of Tennessee to reapportion the legislative districts within the state to reflect population disparities violated the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. In reaching its holdings, the court rejected the argument that the issue presented a non-justiciable political question. In future cases, the decision set the precedent for more judicial involvement in the redistricting of electoral districts. In separate dissenting opinions, the dissenters acknowledged the importance of the issue at hand. Still, they cautioned against the perceived judicial activism of the majority in the decision, which they believed would result in judicial overreach into a political process traditionally reserved for the state legislature. The court's reasoning. The reasonings behind the Supreme Court's decision in Baker v. Carr was based on the interpretation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment to the United States Constitution. The court's majority found that the failure to reapportion legislative districts had led to gross inequalities in representation, effectively denying the principle of one person, one vote. Justice William Brennan, who wrote the opinion of the court, clarified that the case was justiciable and not a political question beyond the reach of the courts. He argued that the judiciary had a duty to protect the rights of the citizens when their rights were threatened by the legislative inaction. The court also reasoned that permitting such disparities to continue would infringe upon the fundamental rights of voters by diluting their voting strength based on their place of residence. By recognizing the justiciability of the issue, the court set a precedent for future cases involving electoral fairness and representation, reinforcing the necessity of equitable legislative districts to ensure democratic governance. As you see below, urban vote and rural vote should be the same. Now, the impact on business or society today. The ruling in Baker v. Carr case had profound and lasting effects on both businesses and society. It established the principle of the one person, one vote, leading to a more representative and equitable system of electoral politics in the United States. As a result, the legislative districts are now required to be drawn in a way that reflects population changes, ensuring fair representation for all citizens. This, in turn, has led to increased civic engagement and activism, as people are more aware today of their power to effect change through the judicial system. In terms of its impact on businesses, the decision has resulted in a more representative government that is better able to respond to the needs and concerns of its constituents. This could lead to a more equitable economic policies and resource distribution, as well as increased transparency and accountability in the electoral process. On a societal level, though, the case has had a lasting impact on the importance of voting rights and equal representation in a democratic society. It has also inspired further legal challenges to gerrymandering and other forms of electoral manipulation, reinforcing the idea that every vote should have equal weight. What I learned and how it connects to the principle I chose? Well, this case was very significant to me in terms of understanding the constitutional law principle presented in Chapter 5. I better grasped the constitutional significance of legislative apportionment and its role in supporting the principle of one person, one vote. In the context of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment, moreover, the nature of the legal issues faced by the court in course of examining Baker v. Carr demonstrates that the problem of constitutional law in the majority of cases revolves around broad interpretations of individual rights, which may not always be feasible in a modern social environment. The founding fathers tried to do their best to allow the people to be free and protected under the rule of law, but in most cases, the implementation of such ideas may be found to be ineffective due to practical complications, as demonstrated by the case under analysis. The involvement of the judiciary system in the process of democracy enforcement is likely to yield the expected outcome. These are my sources that I researched from to inquire more about the Baker v. Carr case. And thank you guys so much for listening to this presentation, and I hope you guys are all having a great day out there. Thank you.